Wasteland Coder here. Today we're going to take another deeper look at Docker again. So today we're going to talk about containers and images and what the difference between these are. So basically, a container is something that you run. And an image is something that you build. That's basically it. Just something, a container is what you run, an image is what you build. But I know you guys will want a little bit more explanation than that, so let's dig in a little bit. Start by taking a look at a Docker file. So this is a very basic, very simple Docker file. We can see there's a couple directives here, a from and a run. From is just basically the image that we're going to build this image on top of, and in this case we're using Ubuntu, and then this colon is for the basically version tag of that image, and we're just pulling latest. And so we're going to build this new image on top of the Ubuntu base image, and Ubuntu itself is probably built on another base image, and Docker has a special base image called Scratch, which is really just an empty image. It doesn't have anything in it. And so most of the time we'll be basing off of something like Ubuntu or Alpine, which is a very, very small base image that has most of the stuff that you need. It's kind of optimized for a Docker world. Ubuntu isn't specifically optimized for Docker, but it still works just perfectly fine. The next directive that we have is run, and we have this kind of odd syntax, bracket syntax here. You can go look at the Docker file reference for what this really means. There are different ways that you can pass this in, but this one is, I think, it's just the most consistent between the different directives. And we're just passing in the echo command and hello world. So what this is going to do is when we build this image, it's going to start up a container actually and run this command inside that container and then exit, and it'll basically save the state of that container as our new base image, or as our new image. And so immediately we see that containers and images are very closely tied together. And let's take a look at the output for when we call that command. So we're just doing docker build, passing in the current directory as the build context, and Docker is just going to look in this build directory by default for a file named Docker file, and if it finds it, it'll use that to build the image. You can override that, pass in a different command line flag to override what the actual name of the build file is. The -t is to just give it a tag. In this case we're going to call it image. So what it actually builds that, it sends the context to the Docker daemon. The build context is what we just passed there, which is in this case the current directory. And so we can see that it's going to run two steps. First step is from, which is what we expected. So from the Ubuntu latest image, it has for output this hash, which is the hash of the image that is Ubuntu latest, and then it starts with the second step, which is our run directive, and so it just spits out what it's going to do, echo hello world. We can see here that it's starting up a container and running inside of that container. We see that hello world output, and then it says removing that intermediate container, and that's the same container there. And then it's committing that result to a new image, which it's gonna call this with this hash. And then that, since that's the last step, says successfully built, and then it's gonna tag it with the tag that we asked it to, image, and then for a version it defaults to just latest. Okay, so we had a run command that when we built an image, the run command runs inside of a container, and that result gets saved into a new image. Okay, so what happens if we don't want this command to run inside of a container that we use when we're building the image? Because I mean the result of echo hello world isn't really anything. It's very nearly a no-op, because this end image that we just built, image latest, it looks basically the same as the Ubuntu latest image, because this doesn't really change the container or the image any. Right, it's just some output. It's like a debug statement. It doesn't actually change the output. It's just something you can see. So if we want to change the behavior of the container that we run off of an image, there are other Dockerfile directives that we can put in there to do that. So in this case, another simple Dockerfile, same from command or from directive, and then here we have entry point instead of run. So what this is going to do is basically tell Docker that I don't want to run this command right now, but I want you to bake it into the image so that when we run a container from this image, it's going to start with this command. That's what the entry point means. It's going to start by running this command. So if we build this, we have the same build command line basically. It sends the build context. We can see it runs from the same Ubuntu base image. That hash is the same as the one that we had before, but it's a new container that it's running in. Before it was a 5CA container. This time it's some F6.8 container that is going to run inside of. But immediately it says we're removing that container, and then it commits that as a new image with this hash. So it successfully built that image and then tags it again. So here we don't see this command, or the output of this command, hello world. It's not in here like we saw it before right there. But this time, if we run a container from this image, so using Docker run, this flag is just to say allocate a terminal and interactive, and this --rm is to remove the container when you're done. That just is a nice way to keep your box a little bit cleaner so that you don't have a bunch of kind of stopped containers sitting out there. And then what we're going to run is called, the image that we're going to run is the one that we just built called image, and it's going to default to just pulling the latest. And so we see that the output is just hello world, and then the container will exit. So the entry point command is what ran when we actually started up the container in hello world. Okay, so next we're going to take a look at a slightly different way to pass that entry point, or pass the arguments to the entry point. So there's a new directive here called command. And I've been trying here to not say the word command very much, but it obviously slipped in a couple of times because command has this special connotation inside of a Docker file. It would have been a little bit more clear to me if they would have just named this argument or something, because this is really the arguments that they're going to pass to the entry point. But you can kind of see why they called it command if you think that most of the time the entry point is going to be something like just run a shell or bash or something like that. And so in those cases the command that you pass in would be something more like Java or npm or node or something like that. So in this case, when we build this image, it's got the same build command. We see it starts from the same base image, and then the second step here is entry point, which is the echo. We see a slightly different thing than we did before here with this using cache. Before we didn't see any of that, it was always just a running in. In this case, this came from just me building this same Docker file multiple times on my machine, and so Docker will try to optimize its image builds for cases like this where you are you're running a bunch of directives on top of each other or on top of a base image to end up with a final result. And quite often these things don't change a whole lot, and so what it'll do is save a result of a directive that you run before and just reuse that for future builds. So in this case, it's going to reuse this image that I built before, and then it's going to run our hello world directive here, which again, it's just going to use cache and spit out the output, but it doesn't echo hello world or anything like that here. again, because it's just the entry point. It's not actually running this command yet. It's more of just saving it off for use when we actually start up a container. And so it builds the container, saves it off, tags it. So when we run this, docker run image again, we see this output, hello world. So very similar to what we saw before, except it's got this shell command here, which is, we didn't see that before. So it's doing something slightly different here, but we won't really dig into what that difference is yet. But the big benefit that you get from using the command directive instead of just the entry point is that we can easily override the command that gets passed in. And so if we just change our run to look more like this, run the image, but here we're passing arguments into the entry point is what we're doing here. So we're basically overriding that command directive that was in our base image. We're just saying hello out there. The output of this is just hello out there. And again, it doesn't have the shell output here like we had up here. So it's doing something slightly different, but it's not, it's exactly what we expected, just the output of hello out there. Now on your command line, when you go to run an image, you can also override the entry point that you pass into the image with the -- entry point flag. And that's useful a lot of times in development, but most of the time in production you're not going to do that. You just use the entry point that you bake into the image, because that should be what you want to run. But in development, quite often you need to get into the container to debug something or just look around, and so quite often you don't actually run the entry point, you override it with something else. And when you build images, each image that you build on top of another one, if you put an entry point in your Docker file, it's going to override anything that came in from the base image. So if Ubuntu had a entry point, then in this case we're going to override it and use echo rather than what Ubuntu had specified for us to use. Alright, hope that helps when thinking about images and containers. Again, containers are things that run, images are things that you build. Thanks. See you next time. Bye.